Russia wants volunteers for Ukraine. The Russian war in Ukraine has been a costly effort for both Ukraine and Russia. The indisputable fact is that Russia holds a population demographic advantage over Ukraine. The Russian population is 3.8 times greater than the Ukraine population, and this gives Russia a significant advantage in the long-term prospects of winning the war. The war has also displaced part of the Ukraine population either through occupying territory or the 6 million Ukrainians that have fled the country for safety and to avoid military service. Why, with this significant population advantage that Russia holds, why is it pursuing policies that have made it appear that Russia is at the bottom of its manpower pool? The Russian Ministry of Defense has announced an additional call-up of 170,000 conscripts to increase its active military to 1.32 million. This is an increase from the beginning of the war when the Russian army stood at 1 million men. It is accepted that the Russians do not release accurate casualty figures, but the estimate is that Russia has suffered 315,000 casualties. These are high casualties and higher than the Ukrainians, but considering that Russia has a population of 144 million, the loss of 315,000 casualties would not be debilitating to Russia to maintain a field army of its size. The fact that the Russian army strength has risen 32%, it seems like it is more than able to replace its casualties. Russia has claimed that an additional 170,000 will not be filled primarily by expanding the draft, but most of it will be filled by additional volunteers. The question is, from where are these volunteers coming from in Russia? Russia is doing this in two ways. One, by offering amnesty to prisoners in exchange for them to join the Russian army. The other is Russia is offering a pathway to citizenship for migrants in Russia that volunteer to join the army and go to Ukraine. Most migrants seeking better economic conditions come from Central Asia, most of them from former Soviet republics. These migrants must serve for at least 1 year and go to Ukraine and fight in Ukraine for 6 months. There have also been multiple reports that the Russian police have been rounding up migrants and forcing them to join the army or get arrested and face eventual deportation. The Russian version of volunteers is to come for prisoners and migrants to make up volunteers for Ukraine. The question is, why is Russia relying on these methods to gather volunteers when Russia already has compulsory military service for all males to 1 year in the military? The fact that the wartime casualties had not disrupted the economy that would require the seeking of volunteers from its large eligible manpower pool raises questions. Does the Russian leadership have concerns that a long war that keeps drawing from the eligible population risks social upheaval? The release of non-Russian or criminal volunteers to fill the ranks means that the general Russian population can be insulated from the cost of the war, and thus continue to give their support for the war. This also means that Russia can mitigate risks to its egalitarian myth and allow the elites in society to avoid wartime service, because these volunteers will prevent a call-up of ever greater amounts of Russians to go to war. These could be the Russians who could start asking questions if the elite are seen as taking advantage of the riches of Russia, but never have to sacrifice for it. The other issue that could be a reason on relying on non-Russians to fight is that despite Russia having a demographic advantage over the Ukraine, it has a demographic time bomb of its own. The Russian birth rate is 1.5 children per woman, which is considered below the replacement rate of 2.1 per woman. The other issue is that there is 86 males for every 100 females. The Russian government wants to increase the birth rate above replacement levels, but this is also harder to attain when the male to female ratio is significantly different. The Russian government tries to present the idea of traditional family, and it could not want to increase the number of children born if it's largely created by single mothers, because it would be contrary to this Russian idealism. This means that Russia may not want to sacrifice many young men in a war in Ukraine if it means it cannot attain its other goal to increase the birth rates. This is all speculative, but seems to point towards the truth. Russia has not suffered enough casualties in the war in Ukraine to rely on incentivizing prisoners and immigrant volunteers to serve in the war in Ukraine. The insulating of the general population and the elite from the cost of war and preserving its male population to serve the national goal of increasing the birth rates are strong reasons not to call up Russian conscripts through an already existing universal male service requirement. The use of volunteers gathered by the carrot or the stick serves the Russian national interest, even with its already significant manpower advantage over the Ukraine.